In this talk, I'd like to present two concepts which I consider to be the most important or two of the most important concepts in the whole theory of heritage, and especially in museums. These two concepts are representation and interpretation. To understand the complexity of heritage, we need to realize that all the past that we want to treat as an object of heritage is something that is some kind of domain that we don't have real contact with. In other words, the past is gone. We can't have contact with the people from the past. We can never have the full picture of the past. We can, however, try to understand it, try to reconstruct it, try to imagine what the past life was for the people from the past. Representation is so important because it tells us that what we deal with in heritage are only small fragments, small representations of the past. Very often those representations, those fragments, have shape of objects, are material. But as in our lives, not only material things and not only objects matter. As every day all of us face various emotions, dilemma, problems, the diversity of emotions and feelings that we go through was probably as big as it is today, was probably as big in the past. So what I'm trying to say now is that the past was as diverse as the contemporary times are for us. That's why everything that we know and that we learn and that we teach about the past is not really based on what we're able to do with our lives. We are not able to give the meanings that we can promise that are the meanings that were given to the past by the people who used to live in the days where we don't really have contact with today. So, on one hand, representation is the concept that tells us that what we do in heritage and how heritage works bases on fragments and merely on fragments of the past. And our task as heritage interpreters is to try to narrate those fragments, is try to base our knowledge about the past on those small objects, testimonies and traces of the past that we have today, that we can deal with in museum, for instance, in museum collections. So there is representation and there is interpretation. And interpretation sounds very dynamic, and indeed it is very dynamic. And to prove what I mean by the dynamics of interpretation, I'd like to show you several objects that I would consider to constitute my personal heritage. By the way, I would like to encourage everyone to construct their own boxes of me so that you could choose some objects that you think that represent you. When you say that these objects represent you, what you probably mean is that they speak about something important that you consider to be the most significant thing about yourself. So I'd like to show you three objects that I've chosen to be a part of my own box of me. Okay? So the first object that I'd like to show is a shell. And if you imagine that you're a museum professional, so let's say museum custodian or a museum curator, the first thing that you would do before you include the object in your collection would be to describe it, describe what it's made of, what colors it's got, when it was created, if we can say when it was created, because it would be probably quite difficult with a shell to say when exactly it was created, okay? And the first sort of type of museum description would be about what it's made of, what materials, what techniques, who made it, when it was made, maybe also why it was made. What I'm saying is that the first part of description, the first part of describing any exhibit or any object would be about its material conditions, its material dimensions also. So here there's a shell, and look, I've never ever said anything about the meaning, and you still don't know why I've chosen it to represent me, okay? The second object that I'd like to show is an object that's probably not very valuable objectively, but it's very precious to me. But again, before we can go on into the section of meanings, we need to, I should probably describe it as a metal object. Well, it was made in the beginning of 20th century, and it's a pastry cutter, so you can cut the pastry in order to make pierogi out of it. Now obviously you can imagine that there's a story behind. So when I start to say this story, it will be very easy to understand that the reason why I've chosen this pastry cutter is because it was handed to me by my grandmother, who got it from her mother, and so on. And today, when I make pierogi, what happens is that I can imagine the same gestures, the same technique, the same actions that my ancestors did. So for me, in this small and very simple object, there's a lot of meaning inside. The same would go with the shell, okay? This shell came all the way from Australia, and it's one of the souvenirs that I received from one of my ancestors who ages, or maybe not ages, but decades ago had immigrated to Australia. So it's not for the shell, it's for the meaning that I'm choosing it, because this for me, this is supposed to represent my love for travels, my search for freedom, and so on, okay? This also represents some different idea than merely the technique of cutting pastry and making pierogi, okay? So, as you can very easily conclude, even with the use of those two examples, the representation is always connected with meanings, and these meanings are formulated from some specific perspective, yeah? So the question would be, who's got the right, who's got the authority to interpret heritage? We already know, or we can imagine that it's such a big power, because it's all about the meanings. It's all about trying to say what kind of meaning stands behind the shell, what kind of meaning stands behind the pastry cutter, yeah? So the question would be, what do those objects stand for, and what kind of ideas do they represent? This is another meaning of the concept of representation that we come across in heritage. But at the same time, all the objects and all their meanings are also intermediated, are also interpreted. So for all of you, probably this shell would have very different meaning than myself. The question is also, or another question is, how the authority to interpret and to give meanings to objects and heritage is used, or maybe sometimes abused or overused, by heritage institutions. To illustrate this fact, I would like to show you a very famous picture. It's a picture showing a very realistically painted pipe, and below the writing says, "This is not a pipe." Okay? Obviously, it's a kind of humoristic game with all those who can watch and try to interpret the picture. But one of the questions that may be posed here is why someone who gives you the image of the pipe immediately wants to say, hey, this is not a pipe. Maybe this is a kind of call to all of us that we should not mistake images with the real meaning. Maybe it's not the same. Maybe we should not mistake images with objects, because they are not the same either. But maybe it's also one of those thoughts, one of those reflections that we should not be we should not be overconfident, thinking that we know the absolute and the final meaning of objects, of exhibits, and of their representations. Here, this image is a graphical representation of an object, but it's not the object itself. In heritage, very often we may be tempted to mistake the absolute truth with our imaginations, to mistake our interpretations with what we'd like to see as objective history. I'm showing these two objects that I started with, that I took from my box of me, also because I wanted to conclude this part with mentioning that we are very keen on working with material objects, even though sometimes we want to speak about very abstract things. So even when the aim of some kind of narrative, just like in a museum exhibition, would be some abstract idea, just like freedom or war or anything bigger than an object, very often museums or other heritage institutions would like to provide some material objects just as a kind of an anchor for a story. Sometimes we are used to think that those objects are big testimonies, are a kind of proofs that the past happened as we want to retell it. But we have to be really conscious about this aspect of living in a very fragmented contact with the past. Whatever we do would be much more interpretation than representation of the past as we'd like to see it in a way that it actually happened. We're not really so sure. Life in the past was definitely as diverse and as multivocal as we experience it today. So why trust in material representations in an infinite way? Let's think about representation and interpretation as two different processes that give the real dynamics to theory of heritage, but also let's keep in mind that this means that what we have, what's left from the past, would be always only fragments, so we are somehow condemned to interpret.